Okay, kids, so welcome back to school. This will be our lecture on functional groups. It'll be tying along with what we talked about today when we were talking or talked about last time when we were discussing organic compounds. So today we're going to be talking about functional groups, ladies and gentlemen. Now, what exactly is a functional group? A functional group, ladies and gentlemen, is the part of a molecule. Um, So here we have a molecule, and a functional group will be a part of that molecule that I'll call that Fg, call that a functional group, that reacts in a very specific way. Okay, so reacts in a very specific way. Now you can see that this functional group here is tied to this chain of carbons. Remember that we had carbons at each one of the endpoints and junctures. And so let's say we had another molecule here. Whoops, that's a little bit too thin, isn't it? Okay, we had another molecule here. Sorry about that. All right, and let's just say we have something like this, and we have a functional group. Now, even though it looks like right here, this functional group would be attached, even though this functional group is attached to a completely different molecule, this one being some straight molecule, and this one being, a ring of some sort, the functional groups are going to act very similarly. And we're going to discuss that. What do I mean similarly? Well, if another compound comes in, and let's just say another functional group comes in from somewhere else, we'll call this functional group 2. This functional group 2 will react to this functional group. And that functional group will react the same way to this functional group because these will be the same. So we're going to talk about the different functional groups, and then later on, we're going to talk about what happens with them and how they react. So let's just start off quickly by taking a look at our first functional group. Now, there are thousands of different functional groups, and we're only going to be talking about a few of them. So you can see this first functional group, these are the amines, all right? So an amine functional group has a very specific function. But before we get to that, what I'd like to do is remind you, because we talked about these R before, right? So each of these R's, these are carbon chains, right? These are not elements. They stand for a chain of carbons. Whereas this capital N stands for nitrogen, the H's stand for hydrogen. This R, for example, this one here, right, will stand for a carbon chain attached to a nitrogen, right? Whatever the carbon chain is, it doesn't matter. And then attached to 2 hydrogens. This here, there's 2 R's, which means there's 2 carbon chains, which means there's probably a carbon chain coming in this way. And then my nitrogen attached to my hydrogen. And then another carbon chain. And maybe this carbon chain is a ring structure. Doesn't matter. It's that there's carbons attached to the nitrogen. And this one says there's 2 carbon chains attached. This amine here, this has 3 R's attached to it, which means this nitrogen has 3 carbon chains attached. So there's our carbon chain, there's a nitrogen, and then another carbon chain, and then another carbon chain, right? 3 bonds for the nitrogen. Each one of these nitrogens has the 3 bonds. And each one of these nitrogens are going to be called an amine group. Again, the R is just a carbon chain. It could be 1 carbon, it could be 100 carbons. It doesn't matter. So let's take a look at our amine groups. So our amine groups, ladies and gentlemen, oops, let me get rid of that. Our amine groups are going to be when you have a nitrogen, right? Pretty much anytime you're going to have a nitrogen in a compound, it's going to be some sort of an amine or some form thereof. And you can probably hear the word amino acid. And you guys learned about amino acids when you were in your biology class. Those amino acids are probably going to have what inside of them? What element would they have? They'll have this nitrogen. So an amine group will be a nitrogen that's connected to either a carbon, 2 carbons, or 3 carbons, okay? And here's an example right here. Here's our nitrogen, all right? Remember that these chains, these are all carbons all through here. These are all carbons on each one of these points. And this nitrogen is connected to this carbon chain, and this carbon chain is very complicated. And then this nitrogen is also connected to another carbon out here. So there's one carbon coming in, another carbon, and then it's attached to a hydrogen. And if you see that functional group, then we would call this an amine. And an example of that would be a methamphetamine. Now, I'm going to be talking about lots of different chemicals, things, different drugs like caffeine, or I might bring in cocaine or THC or any compound there are. I don't condone any of those compounds or any kind of drug use, but since we hear in movies and TVs, we hear this terminology all the time, I'm going to sit there and I'll talk to you about it and what they are. So that's it. So this would be methyl, and this is called methamphetamine. And this functional group right here makes it an amine group, okay? This would be an amine functional group. So let's move on and take a look at another compound. Another functional group that we're going to be talking about is alcohol. Now, when I say alcohol, yeah, I'd be talking about the alcohol that people drink, but I'm basically talking about this functional group right here. This is an OH. It's an oxygen with a hydrogen attached. And that this functional group is a carbon attached to an oxygen. For example, this would be a carbon. This is a carbon, right? So if you take a look at this carbon and this carbon, this is a carbon chain attached to this OH group, all right? We would call that, this will be ethanol, which is what you would find in beer or wine, all right? So an alcohol is any carbon chain, and it doesn't matter what it is, with, an OH attached to the side of it. So it doesn't matter what it's attached to. This could be a single carbon attached to an OH, which would make it methanol. Or you could have some complicated structure here where you'd have 2 rings attached to each other, right? And then coming off to the side, you might have an OH functional group. That would be an alcohol functional group. And so any of these would be alcohols. Now, this didn't turn out very well. This froze me out. That should have an OH right there, but my page, for whatever reason, I think I increased the size too much. That should be an OH right there. So if we take a look at this molecule here, you can see that there are 2 different groups. Now, we just talked about it a second ago. What was the name of this functional group right here? Do you guys remember the name of this functional group? That's right, that's called an amine functional group. And since there's an OH on here, that's an alcohol group. And so you would say that this molecule would have 1 amine functional group and 1 alcohol functional group. Now, let's take a look at this next functional group, these next functional groups. These next functional groups are called ethers. Ether. Now, what seems to be the characteristic of an ether? Well, an ether looks like it has an oxygen that is in between 2 carbons. And it could be something as simple as this right here, which is the drawing we have, 2 carbons with an oxygen. Or we have this R, and this R prime, what that means is that it's a second carbon chain different than this R. So this would be R chain 1, this would be R chain 2. So an ether could be something like this, where you have a carbon chain, and then you have a different carbon chain. Doesn't matter what it is. And since the carbon and the other carbon has an oxygen in between it, we call that an ether, right? So this would be 1 carbon chain, and this little prime here, R prime, would be a second carbon chain. And it doesn't matter. So it could be something like this. You could have like one carbon chain with that oxygen and then another one. This is an ether. So let's take a look at this compound down here. This compound is MDMA, okay? The street name for that is called ecstasy, all right? Now, if we take a look at this compound, we can see that there's more to it than just a bunch of carbon chains. We have some oxygens, we have a nitrogen over here, but let's take a look at this oxygen. Now, if we're gonna look at the ether, how many oxygens do we have in between, right, carbons? You can see here that we have one oxygen in between two carbons, and we have another oxygen in between two carbons, and in this compound right here, we have two ether compounds, or I'm sorry, functional groups inside of this compound. And we also have an amine, right? So we would say we have two ether functional groups, and we have one amine functional group, all right? And that's what we would have written for MDMA. Okay, the next functional group that we're gonna work with is called a carbon ring. Now, a carbon ring is exactly what it sounds like. It's a ring of carbon. And so, whoops, I lost my cursor. It's a ring of carbon. And you remember that each one of these little things, there's a carbon on each one of those corners, right? And obviously there'll be some hydrogens, but this is a carbon ring. Right here, we also have a carbon ring. So this one here, we would say is a carbon ring. So you have one carbon ring on this one here, one carbon ring. And then right down here, you can see this, that's a nitrogen in between two carbons. And there's a hydrogen attached to that, obviously. And so you'd have one amine group, one amine group. And then this would be an example. This would be a carbon ring. Even though there's a double bond right here, this is also a carbon ring because the carbon is, it creates a ring of just carbon. And this here, we would have two rings. And I'll put two C rings here, two carbon rings. Sorry, my other scribble board, it's not working, so my writing is absolutely horrendous. I'm blown away that the board makes that big a difference. And then if you take a look at this next one, this is not a carbon ring right here because it's not a complete ring of carbons. What is the name of this compound? Which is the functional group that has an oxygen and it has an oxygen in between two carbons? What do we call that? This functional group here is called an ether. All right, so it's called an ether. So anytime you see an oxygen with two carbons on the side, again, it could look anything like, oh, well, we already did ether. We're on carbon rings. I was like, I didn't give you an example. So we've gone over several different functional groups. And now what we're doing is we're getting into, if there's nothing better, if there's nothing else on your molecule, except for just straight carbon. So you have a molecule and it's just like this. It could go on forever and nothing else is attached to it. We're going to call that an alkane. That's going to be an alkane. And the alkane means it's just all single bonds all the way through. This is not an alkane because you have this structure, but then there's an OH group. This would be an alcohol, right? And an alcohol because you have an OH attached to a carbon, and that oxygen is attached to a hydrogen. An alkene, ladies and gentlemen, is very similar to an alkane, but there's a double bond in there. So you'd have whatever molecule you have, and you have a double bond. And that double bond could be anywhere. It could be on the first carbon, the last carbon, doesn't matter. This is not an alkene, all right? Because there's this amine functional group. And the amine functional group takes precedence. So we would call this an amine, right? And this would be called an alcohol. But if there's nothing else, then we would call it either an alkane or an alkene. And that takes us to number 7 right here, the 7th that we're going to get. A triple bonded compound is called an alkyne. So just like what's shown, you have any carbon chain, right? And you throw a triple bond between those two carbons, which means 3 bonds. We talked about bonding before. That makes an alkyne. This one is not an alkyne because you can see this would be a carbon, that would be another carbon, and you would have an ether here. So an ether would be the oxygen with carbons on both sides of it. So let's take a look and let's quickly do a couple of examples. So we have two problems. So here we go. What do we have right here for practice problem number 1? Practice problem number 1 has how many different functional groups? How many functional groups do you see on this one? That's right, there's 2 functional groups. You have a functional group right here, and then you have this functional group right here. What would we call the functional group where you have this arrow pointing to? What would we call that functional group, ladies and gentlemen? That's right, you would call that functional group an amine. And what would we call that functional group? What do we call that functional group right down here where I just drew a second arrow down here? Number 2, what would we call this functional group? Yep, we would call that a carbon ring, okay? So this would have an amine and a carbon ring on it, ladies and gentlemen. So let's take a look at this next one here. Oops, I didn't pause the video, but that's okay. All right, and this next one here, how many functional groups do we have on this one right here? That's right, we have 3 functional groups. Now, what's the name of this right here? What would we call this functional group? What would we call this functional group? All right, we would call this, ladies and gentlemen, not a ring, which is what most people want to say. This right here is an ether because you have a carbon surrounding an oxygen. So we're going to call that an ether. What do we call this? Let me see if I can get down there. I can't get down there. What do we call this functional group in green, ladies and gentlemen? What do we call this functional group? That's right. That functional group is called an alcohol. And lastly, ladies and gentlemen, this light blue, what do we call this functional group right in here? Yep, you call it an amine. Well done. All right, so good stuff. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of resources you have. So this is a functional group chart, and you're going to be able to use it. I mean, you're at home, you have a computer. There's absolutely no reason why you don't keep this thing close to you and get A's on every single quiz. This quickly just shows you what we're working with. Alcohols, ladies and gentlemen, have and this is the functional group, is the OH, right? And you have a carbon with an oxygen attached to a hydrogen, right? And an example will be methanol. So you can take it straight through. That's an ether, and it looks like we talked about an amine, and you're probably going to go, whoa, Mr. Pepik, looks like we're going to talk about carboxylic acids, esters, aldehydes, ketones, and and amide. So this is what we are going to be working with, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so use that resource. I've also attached it as a one of those PDFs. It's on your homework. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you, if you have any questions, please ask. Just answer a few short questions, and you'll be done for today. All right, so have a good day.